We communicate a lot with saying very little. So much is said without a word, and if you don't believe me, just spend any amount of time with a teenager, and they will tell you a whole lot without saying very much at all. We may not realize it, but we can communicate 93%-ish of our stories without saying a word. But only getting 93% of a story can sometimes be frustrating, right? Sometimes only getting part of the story can be really annoying. Now, with my kids, when they're trying to tell me something, and I'm just like, get to the point. I don't need the whole story. Just tell me what you want to tell me, right? But like during NFL season, when I have a TV show that I'm trying to record and I set my DVR and it's ready to record, and then the 3 NFL games that are on earlier that day run late and push my recording, and I get towards the end of my show and I realize that I missed the last 7 minutes, the climax. Anybody with me? Right? Like 93% of the story isn't good enough. I need the whole episode. I want to know what happened at the end. And when it comes to situations and moments, parts of our lives that really matter, 93% doesn't cut it. We want the whole story. We want 100% of it. And that's where words can become really important. That last 7% means a lot. Today we're finishing up a series across all of our campuses as we've been looking at some intentional practices and rhythms that we can leverage in our lives to make a difference in the lives of others. And in this series, we've been unpacking different practices to help us fulfill the mission that Jesus has called us to help people find and follow God. And this isn't just the mission that Jesus gave a church organization, it's the mission that he gave all of us, because the truth of the matter is this: we are the church. This is the mission that God has given all of us. And in this series, we've been learning how to step into this mission and be a blessing to the people that God has placed in our lives. And we've been using this word BLESS as an acronym, as a field guide to help us lean in and begin to practice and share the mission that God has called us to. And we started with the letter B, and we said it stands for begin with prayer. That we got to start here because we recognize that God is the only one that changes and transforms lives. And so I'm going to, in prayer and in full dependence, come to God and ask that he would do some work, that he would change the hearts and lives of people around me, that he would give me opportunity. And we encouraged and challenged everyone to set an alarm at 1 o'clock to pray for your one. The one person that is in your life that is far from God. That you would be praying that God would give you an opportunity, give them an opportunity to know and believe and trust in Jesus. And then we said the L stands for listen. That we wouldn't just listen to respond, but we would be listeners to understand. To be present in a conversation and engaged, listening and caring. And that one tool of listening can be such a powerful tool in helping people experience the love of God, to let them know they're cared enough that I'll listen to their story. And then we got to the E, and we said that stands for eat. That's kind of my favorite one. And eating, this opportunity to share life together, to do everyday, normal, common things, but to do it with such intentionality to engage and build relationships, not just with people we know, but with people we don't know. And then last week, Pastor Reg talked about the first S, serve, and what it looks like to be giving of ourselves to serve and meet the practical needs of those around us. And if you look at this list so far, most people would be on board with praying for others, being a better listener, sharing a meal at times, even helping others. In fact, you don't need to be a follower of Jesus to do any of those things. They're good things for anybody to put into practice in their life. Lots of religions pray. Lots of people meditate. What's so unique or important about these things if you don't even have to be a follower of Jesus to put them into practice? Well, while each of these things can be used by God to move someone forward in their journey of faith, what I want us to think about is that these represent the 93% of the story. The things that we've talked about in this series thus far, they're really good, they're really helpful. They'll get us about 93% there. In fact, everything that we've talked about so far can be done with little to no words. We can pray without verbally having to say words. We can listen to someone and say very little, and we can have people over for dinner and accomplish very little with our words. We can do all of these things. I can serve someone. I don't have to speak. So today we wrap up this B.L.E.S.S series with the last S, and this is that last 7% of the story. That last S stands for story. Story. When we share how Jesus has impacted my life, how my story was transformed because of what Jesus has done. This is that step that closes the loop for people and helps draw them back into a relationship with Jesus. Now, many of you may have heard this quote before. It's attributed to Francis of Assisi. He says, preach the gospel at all times. If necessary, use words. Anybody ever hear that one before? I've heard that. I've even used it and preached it. And more recently, I've recognized this. I have an issue with this quote. In fact, I have two. My first issue and my first problem with this quote is that Francis never said it. How would you like to be known for saying something you never said? Right? Yeah, so he never said it. He said something like it, but not actually that. And that actually wasn't his meaning behind what he was trying to say. Look it up. The second problem that I have with this quote, preach the gospel at all times. If necessary, use words. Words are necessary for the gospel. You can't preach the gospel. You can't share the gospel. You can't tell the greater story without words. You might be able to get 93% there. But without words, you miss the most important part. That's why the author of Romans 10:14 says it like this. He says, how then will they call upon Jesus or call upon him in who they have not believed? And the author is challenging people like, preaching matters. And if our goal is to help people find and follow God, how will they call upon him who they have not believed? And how are they going to believe in him who they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching? Hey, when you preach, what do you use? Thank you. Oh, we're locked in now. So faith, here's verse 17. So faith comes from hearing, and hearing through the word of Christ. Preach the gospel at all times, and make sure you use words because they're necessary. Here's the point of our message today and the point of this last S, story. It's this: God has given you a story, and he's called you to share it. We all have a story, so let's begin to share it. We probably see this no better place than in John chapter 9. We see it so simply, the story of someone's life shared in such a simple way. But what keeps us from sharing our story? Because you hear story, you hear the gospel, and we got to use words to share it. But Pastor, if I'm honest, I'm a little nervous. Because what if when I share the story, I get some questions and I don't have the answers? Well, you're in good company. The disciples had a similar issue. And in Matthew 10, after Jesus invites his disciples to join him in this mission of sharing the good news with others, Matthew 10, 19 and 20 says, Jesus says to his disciples, don't be anxious about how you are to speak or what you are to say. Don't be nervous. Don't be afraid about what you're going to say. For what you are to say will be given to you in that hour. For it is not you who speaks, but the Spirit of the Father who speaks through you. And in that moment, as you're listening to someone else's story, as you listen to their question, in that moment, lean into the Spirit of God who is with you and will give you the words to speak. hope and life, love and encouragement. Or maybe you say, look, it's not so much that I don't have the answers. I'm okay with saying that's a great question. Let's find the answer together. That all makes sense. But really my issue is I don't want to impose my beliefs on anybody. Especially in the culture we live in. I don't want to get canceled. I don't want to force that. I don't want to impose that. And well, here's the great news is God is not asking you to impose anything on anybody. He's simply asking you to share your story. Well, that's great, but it just makes me feel uncomfortable, and maybe you don't share your story because it makes you uncomfortable or you think it'll make somebody else uncomfortable, but here's the reality. God hasn't given you a story to keep to yourself. He's given you a story to share with others. And in John chapter 9, we see a man whose interaction with Jesus changes his life, and he goes and begins to share the story. He doesn't have it all together. He doesn't have all the answers. He doesn't impose his beliefs on anybody, and he doesn't make people uncomfortable. But what we do see are 4 ways to help us get better at sharing our story. John chapter 9, verse 1 is where it starts. If you've got a Bible, you can turn there. If you don't have a Bible, let me know. I would love to give you one. But there's also this really great tool called the Bible app, and you can bring up the Bible on your phone as well. Here's what it says. Jesus was passing by with his disciples. He saw a man blind from birth. That's verse 1. He spit on the ground is verse 6. There's a little bit more there. I'm just going to jump to what happens because Jesus does something pretty crazy in this moment. He passes by, he sees a man blind from birth, and he goes up to him and he spits on the ground, and he made mud with his saliva. Can we practice this? Anybody want to volunteer? Right? It's kind of gross. Then he anointed, it gets worse, guys. He anointed the man's eyes with the mud. Let's call it what it is. It's a giant loogie with mud in it. Some of you are like, oh, I just ate breakfast. He anoints the man's eyes with mud, and he says to him, go and wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. So the man went and he washed, and he came back seeing. Somewhere in this moment, a miracle happened. A man blind from birth, all of a sudden, not blind anymore. He'd been blind from birth. Some spit mud is rubbed on his eyes. He's told, hey, go wash. Jesus doesn't lead him there. Jesus doesn't walk him there. He's just got to find his way with mud, spit eyes. Go wash. He washes, and for the very first time, this man experiences an explosion of color in sight. This encounter with Jesus changed his life, and he can't keep quiet about it. And that's how any encounter with Jesus ought to be. Has Jesus changed your life? Do you have a story, a testimony of who you were, but what Christ has done and how he's changed you? If so, it should impact and transform the excitement in which you have to share that story. The story keeps going. It says the people around him, they didn't even believe it was the same guy. Look at verse 9. Verse 9 says, verse 8, the neighbors and those who see him before as a beggar were saying, is this not the man who used to sit and beg? Verse 9 says, some said it is he. Others said, no, it's not him, but it looks like him. And he kept saying, I am the man. No, it is me, I'm the one. So they said to him then, how were your eyes opened? And he answered, the man called Jesus made mud, and he anointed my eyes and said to me, go wash in Siloam. So I went and washed, and I received my sight. Here's the first thing we see when it comes to sharing our story. It's pretty simple. Share your story with honesty. Share your story with honesty. The man doesn't try to excuse away. He doesn't try to say, oh, I went to the pool and I washed. No. He tells people the story of what happened. He tells people, and he's unwilling to let people come up to a conclusion on their own. He says, no, I'm the man. No, you can't be the man. You just look like the man. No, I'm the man. Let me be honest. Let me tell you the truth. I'm he. And this is what happened. Jesus made mud. He put it on my eyes. He told me to wash. I did that, and I got sight. That's what happened. Just be honest with the story. I think sometimes we think that we have to spice up or maybe even dumb down our story. If you're like me, maybe you didn't have a super crazy, radical story, and so you just feel like I don't have much of a story to tell, so I won't tell it at all. Or maybe your story is so dramatic and so powerful, but very personal, and so you dumb it down so that you don't have to get too personal with other people. For those like me, who grew up with the privilege of growing up in a Christian home and having an opportunity early on to be introduced to Jesus and have that opportunity to believe in him, I didn't feel like I had much of a story growing up. And I got to avoid a lot of hurt and a lot of pain and a lot of heartache because of knowing Jesus early on. But it didn't seem like a very compelling or exciting story to tell. The truth is, I've had plenty of rebellion and plenty of barriers to overcome in surrendering my life to Jesus. But part of my story is gratefulness and gratitude for the things that God has protected me from and allowed me to have. Part of my story is the gratitude for the legacy of my grandparents and my parents and their faith that introduced me to faith. Look, I'm not a Christian because they were a Christian, but I had the blessing of being introduced to their stories early on and to the story of Jesus, which kept me from a lot of hurt and a lot of pain. Others of us may have experienced really hard lives, embarrassing, shameful things in our journey towards Jesus. But don't miss this. The man in the story, he may not have been able to fully explain what happened. He maybe didn't have an answer for all of their questions. All he knew is that he had a good news story and he had to tell it. And when we encounter Jesus, just like the blind man met Jesus and he could now see, when you encounter God, he gives you a good news story and he wants you to tell it. It doesn't matter what your past is, what you've done, or what's been done to you. God wants to give you a good news story to share as well. A story that changes everything. And my point is that if God has given you a story, that's your story. It's not anybody else's story. Don't feel like you have to exaggerate it to be more compelling, or that you have to dumb it down or downplay it so it's less shocking or less personal. Be honest with your story. You can be honest without being inappropriate. And here's the final thing. See, if Jesus wanted you to have a different story, he would have given you a different story. He gave you your story. He wants you to share your story, and he'll use your story to impact and change the lives of those around you. When you share your story, do it with honesty. Look what happens next. Verse 13 and 17 gives us this picture of the religious leaders coming onto the scene. They begin hearing what this man was blind and now he sees. Tell us what happened. They're trying to understand and make sense of it all, how to handle it. At first it was the neighbors who found out, then the townspeople. Now the religious leaders are asking, what happened? Verse 15 says, he put mud on my eyes, and I washed, and now I see. That's all I got to say about that. Right? This is what happened. It was pretty simple. He didn't go into a whole bunch of detail about it. He just said what it was. He didn't give every second of the encounter. He was simple and to the point, and when we share our stories, let's do it with simplicity. That's the second thing we see in the story. Like, the man doesn't elaborate even more now that these religious leaders have come. It's not like he gave a piece of the story to the neighborhood and then the religious leaders come and he's like, well, let me tell you. I was just sitting there by the side of the road and this man walked by and I heard him spit on the ground and he put some mud in my eyes, and it was cold, and it felt kind of good, honestly. And then he told me to go wash at the pool, and it was really wet. Like, he didn't do any of that. I was blind, mud, water, I see. That's the story. It's as simple as that. Share your story with simplicity. Sometimes I think we overcomplicate telling our story. We can make it this big, elaborate process, trying to tie in all these extra details. God has given you a story. That story is being added to every day with experiences of you walking with Jesus and stumbling through following him. As you share what God has done and how Jesus is continuing to shape and change your life, share it with simplicity. Keep the message simple so that it's easy for others to understand and relate to. Thirdly, share your story with boldness. Share your story with boldness. Verse 20, this is the parents' response. The Pharisees come to him in verse 19 and says, "Is this your son? And was he born blind?" See, they just want to make sure this isn't a hoax and this isn't some conspiracy. Is this your boy? Was he born blind? And if so, how does he see now? In verse 20, the parents answered, "We know that this is our son, and we know that he was born blind. That's all true. But how he sees now, we do not know, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him, he's of age." And it sounds kind of like, it sounds interesting, right? One reason is they may not actually know. But the context gives us a little bit more insight. Verse 22 says this, his parents, they said these things because they feared the Jews. Because the Jews had already agreed that anyone who would confess Jesus as the Christ was to be put out of the synagogue. They cower in fear rather than share boldly what has happened. Rather than agreeing with their son, look, that's what he said. So we believe that that's what it is. No, he is our son. He was born blind. But anything else, we don't know. We're kind of stepping back. And just ask him. He's old enough to tell you for himself because they were afraid. And the reason many of us who claim to be followers of Christ don't share our faith, have a lack of boldness, is because we're afraid. Maybe you're like me, where I get consumed with sometimes the acceptance of others. What are they going to think? And are they going to approve of my story? And we end up fearing people rather than God. One of the early church leaders, Paul, wrote in his letter to the church in Galatia, he says, look, am I seeking the approval of God or of man? If I'm seeking the approval of man, I cannot be a servant of God. So verse 24 says the religious leaders come for a second time. They called the man who had been born blind and said to him, "Give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner. This man Jesus is a sinner. Give glory to God. Tell us the truth, young man. Be honest for once. This is your final chance." And in the face of mounting pressure, in the face of being excommunicated from the synagogue in the place of Jewish worship, we see the boldness of this man who now, in front of those who had already heard, in front of his parents, in front of the religious leaders, he says in verse 25, whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. Whether Jesus is a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I know, I was blind and now I see. That's the story I've got to tell. The boldness in the face of the mounting pressure, and I love that he doesn't debate, he doesn't argue, he doesn't impose his beliefs, he doesn't make it uncomfortable. He's just honestly, simply, and boldly telling people what he knew to be true. And the story of his life. I was blind. I met Jesus, and so now I see. And right here is where we begin to get a framework for how to share our story. If you've ever wondered before, I don't really know how to share my story, right here shows us 3 steps that this man takes to share his story. An outline, if you will, a starting point for all of us. This man's life was changed, and he was ready to tell anybody that would listen of the story of what Jesus had done for him. I was. What's your story? I was. But God. So now, and any one of us can fill in those blanks, and that is your story. The story that God is writing and has written in your life. What keeps you from boldly sharing your story of how Jesus has changed your life? See, I think many of us will shy away from sharing our story because maybe I don't have one yet. Maybe I know a lot about Jesus. Maybe I've gone to church for a long time, but I've never actually given him my whole life and surrendered myself to him and said, I believe in you completely, to allow him to change and transform your life. Or maybe some of us don't share our story because we've forgotten and we've taken for granted what Jesus has actually done. Church, God has given you a story. He's writing it right now. And he's given you a story so that you can share it. Share it honestly. Share it simply. Share it with boldness. These aren't the only ways we see the man share his story. The fourth thing we see is we see some urgency. And we ought to share our story with some urgency here. Verse 25, whether he's a sinner I do not know. One thing I know, though I was blind, now I see. And they said to him, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? You kind of sense the interrogation. And he answers them, I've told you. I've told you again and again. I've told you already. And you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples? Oh, did you need to hear it again because you want to follow him? And they go like, I know you are, but what am I? That's their response. Look. They reviled him, saying, you're his disciple. But we're disciples of Moses. I know you are, but what am I? We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as of this man, we do not know where he comes from. And the man answered, why is this such an amazing thing? This is incredible. Verse 30, you don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. And we know that God does not listen to sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, God listens to him. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone's eyes has been opened of a man who was born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. They answered him, you were born in utter sin, and you would teach us. And they cast him out. This man sees his opportunity is fleeting. This is the last chance he's going to get. Young man, tell us really what happened. I already told you. And I'll tell you again, and I'll tell you again. I was blind, and now I see. Do you need to know this because you want to follow him? No? Okay, then. All I know is that he's not a sinner. He got to be from God because he did this miracle thing. And we begin to see an urgency and an excitement building as he just kind of goes on his little rant, telling the religious leaders about the God that just changed and transformed his life. Share your story with urgency. The man wouldn't back down. He wouldn't let others change the story. Those who had ignored him his whole life and are now giving him all this attention but want to ignore his story, he continues to tell it over and over. A few months ago, my son Easton was eating, and he was shoving so much food in his mouth, he started to choke. I was sitting across the table, and I saw his eyes begin to water and his face begin to turn red. And I sat there thinking, does he need help? Or is he going to figure this out? Is that what I did? No. Some of you are like, what? It's terrible. I saw him turning red and eyes watering, and I jump up from the table, and I run over, and I start smacking him on the back to help him get that food out so he doesn't die. A lifeguard At a pool, sees a kid bobbing underwater and gasping for breath. Do they sit there and wait, let's just see if he kind of gets a hang of it? No, they jump in the water to save him. There's some urgency here when life is at stake. There's an urgency when someone's choking to death. There's an urgency when someone's drowning to death. What about the urgency with the gospel when people are headed to an eternity of death? Where's the urgency with the gospel? Where's the urgency with the good news of the story that God has given you to help people who don't know Jesus have their lives and eternities changed forever? I want to share a story with us about a transformation that has taken place. But rather than me share the story, we captured it on video. This is Pastor Schuyler, our pastor, our lead pastor for Heritage Church, and our youth pastor at Lake Zurich. Check out his story.
Hey, Ricky, I love the power of stories. You know, just the way our lives are changed. When we start sharing stories, we start hearing about it. We see things different. We feel things in a completely different way. And man, I love that we get a chance to take a moment and hear some of your story. If you're not sure who this is Pastor Ricky. He is our youth pastor here at our Lake Zurich campus and helps oversee youth ministry across the board for our church. And God's done some pretty amazing things in and through Ricky's life. And as he was sharing some of that story, we kind of find ourselves getting captivated by it and listening at how God has used it. And so we asked Ricky if you take a minute. Would you just share a little bit of your story about what life was like maybe before you encountered Christ, what it was like when you encountered Christ, and how your life has been changed as a result of that?
Yeah, my life before Christ was I was entangled with sin. If I can wrap it all up, just sin and, drugs and just living a life of crime. And it was just, my life was spiraling downhill very fast.
Yeah.
I found myself overdosing three times, been shot, been stabbed because of the life that I've chosen to live. And that was that street life. And if it wasn't for God, if it wasn't for Jesus,
right.
I wouldn't be here today.
Yeah.
And just knowing that God saved my life, because I wouldn't be here today if God didn't save my life.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be married. I wouldn't have two beautiful kids.
Right.
And just the fact that God did something amazing in my life.
Yeah.
My story, I've seen people come to know who Jesus is because of my story,
right.
because of the testimony, what God has brought me out of, that bondage, that drugs and alcohol, those are different addictions.
Yeah, I love that. What was that like when you feel like you say, I met God, I met Jesus, like, what was that like? Like how did you come to faith? It was like an angel from heaven, lights coming down, like what was that moment when you're like, that's it, that's when I met Jesus?
Yeah, a lot of people wish they would see like an angel come, but it wasn't like that. I went through this program called Teen Challenge.
Okay.
And when I went through Teen Challenge, that's where I encountered God. That's where God actually met me. At my point, at my lowest point, that's where God met me at in that faith-based rehab. Because if it wasn't for Him, like I said, I wouldn't be here.
And that's when you surrendered your life to Christ and put you on a completely different path.
I surrendered my life to Christ, but it wasn't an easy walk. It wasn't an easy surrender. I surrendered my life. But I was still resisting. As I wanted to leave that program. And actually, this March marks 15 years.
Come on, that's
since
awesome.
I've been saved and sober from drugs.
That's amazing, dude.
And
that's awesome.
Because of the power of God.
Right.
And
of since then, God's used you. I think you're saying, you've literally shared this story, this testimony, hundreds, if not thousands of times to different people, different students, things like that. Is that what God's used it for? You've seen that?
I've seen it in student ministry, just sharing my story with student ministry students for over 10, 11 years now, because that's the story. That's the testimony.
Yeah.
That's my story, what God has done.
Love it.
And when you tell your story to someone, you never know who you're going to impact. Your
right.
story matters. Even though it might not be as dramatic as mine, but your story matters.
Yeah.
There's someone in the room, someone in your family may be going through the same thing that you're going through. They need to hear your story.
Yeah. Man, that's so good. I think that's the reminder for every single one of us, is that we've got a story. And that story is worth telling. So thanks so much for taking a little bit of time. I love it. I love when our students get to hear it, when parents get to hear it, and just to see the way God redeems all of those things for his good and his glory, man. That's what we get to celebrate. So thanks, man. That's awesome.
Thank
love
you.
It. Appreciate it.
Come on, isn't that awesome? Yeah, we can praise God for that. Did you hear the story? Did you hear the outline? Man, I was living in sin. I was living a life of crime. I was living addicted to drugs and OD'd, and I got shot and I got stabbed. That's what I was. But God saved my life. Not just saved him from sin, literally saved his life from getting shot and stabbed and OD'ing. Freed him from addiction. I was that, but God did this. So now, I'm alive. Not only am I alive, but I'm married and I have beautiful kids and I have a story to tell, and I've told it hundreds, if not thousands of times to anyone willing to listen. Your story may not be as dramatic as Ricky's, it might be. It may not be as captivating or as powerful as a blind man receiving sight. But I can tell you beyond a shadow of a doubt, if Jesus has changed your life, you have a story worth telling. You have people that God is bringing in your path, and they need to hear your story. How might your story become a blessing to others? What would happen if we started to share our story about how Jesus has changed my life? See, after the blind man had an encounter with Jesus, and Jesus told him to wash at the pool of Siloam. The passage tells us that that pool, Siloam, it means sent. The pool of Siloam means sent. And once we encounter Jesus, we are always sent back to our neighbors and to our family and to our friends and coworkers to tell the story of how Jesus has changed our lives. Today is your eye-washing moment. Maybe for you, for the very first time, giving your life to Christ, you're saying, today my eyes have been darkened, maybe not physically blind, but spiritually blind for a long, long time. And today, God is going to begin making some things clear. And he wants to send you back to where you came from to help share the good news of what Jesus has done. Maybe for you, your eyes have been washed open and you see clearly and you believe in Jesus, but for a long time, the story has been clouded and blinded because you've been unwilling to share it. Or maybe you just didn't know it. I was, but God. See, if you don't know where to start when it comes to sharing your story, start with this blind man who received his sight started. Start with this outline, with this framework. I was, fill in the blank. But God, fill in the blank. So now, can I tell you what has happened? Fill in the blank. You can use the framework to share all or just parts of your story when you're in a conversation with someone else. This framework can help you share your story honestly, simply, boldly, with urgency to anyone willing to listen. If I were to tell you my story today, using this outline, this framework, this is what it would be. I was searching for acceptance and belonging. I was living for myself, but never finding anything that would satisfy. I felt rejected and alone. I was 14 years old. But God, he reminded me of his love. He showed me that he loved me while I still hated him. He showed me an acceptance and a forgiveness that I was longing for, but could never find in this world. And so now, I found freedom from living for the acceptance of others. My identity is in Jesus Christ. I have purpose and I have worth and I have value because of him. You have a story worth telling. Do you know it? Will you share it? Maybe yours is, I was rejected, but God has accepted me, so now I know that I'm loved. Or I was addicted, but I've been set free when I met Jesus Christ, and so now I live free. I was worried and afraid, anxious, filled with fear. But God reminded me that He's in control, that He's bigger than the challenges I face, and so now I live with peace and hope, with strength, not in myself, but in Jesus Christ. I was, but God. So let me tell you what life's like now. Let me encourage you as we close. You're not responsible for someone else's salvation. You're not responsible for someone else crossing the line. You don't have to have all the answers. You don't need to create a miracle moment. You just have to be part of someone's story by sharing your story. And as followers of Jesus, if you have had an encounter with Jesus, He's sending you back to your friends and to your neighbors and to your circles and to your family to go and share the good news story that God has given you.